Before the video begins, I'd like to address a personal matter. Please join my Discord, where I regularly share smaller updates throughout the day about my new videos. Thank you, and now enjoy the video. This video falls under the fair use law. The following is a fan summary, for entertainment purpose, only, which is not intended to replace the original series. We do not own the anime, manhwa, or any of the artworks, all rights reserved to their respective owners. Please support the official release of this series. This is for people's enjoyment only. This video is not meant to infringe any of the copyrights. The story began above a peaceful and calm, radiant metropolis. One day, out of nowhere, a rift appeared in the sky, tearing through space and time. From this gigantic rift emerged a blue aura that spread across the entire world. The people directly beneath the rift in the metropolis gazed up in fascination and fear, admiring the spectacle. It was a beautiful natural phenomenon that captivated many children and adults alike. Later, people referred to the blue aura as mana. A minority of individuals with a sensitive perception of mana gained a special ability through this natural event. Others called these individuals awakened. After the mana storm subsided, such a natural event did not occur again. The rift, remaining high in the sky, persisted, and over time, people around the world became accustomed to the existence of the awakened. Blue, large, storm-like mana portals appeared everywhere, naturally guarded and secured by the government to protect the well-being of the citizens. However, this situation was not permanent because, after a while, the blue, picturesque portals changed, becoming increasingly red until they collapsed and shattered. The soldiers guarding the portal were astonished and turned around in the midst of such a collapse. From the red portal, only a luminous, sentient entity became visible, revealing itself as a monstrous creature the next moment, once again stunning and frightening the world. This monster resembled a cyclops with two heads. On the left side, it had a body covered in stones and a head with one eye, while the right side of the body was covered in warts and pimples, possessing a troll-like head. These portals were colloquially referred to as gates. The monsters in the portals, as the initial glance suggested, were not friendly towards humans. They looked down on the guards tasked with protecting the portal and swiftly dealt with them. The curious onlookers who wanted to get a closer look at the portal quickly realized their predicament and fled immediately upon the appearance of the monsters to secure their safety. Panic-stricken, they ran as fast as possible, accompanied by loud and frantic screams echoing through the city. However, even as practically everyone fled, there was one who faced the danger head-on and confronted the monsters. From that day on, the entire world found itself in the midst of a kind of apocalypse. The man who did not immediately flee stood directly in front of the monster, showing no signs of panic or intent to run away, much like the other people. It didn't take long for the monstrous entity to seize the opportunity and swing its weapon to eliminate the courageous man. Yet, even in such a situation, the man seemed unafraid and continued to confront the monster. Our protagonist was running through a dense forest in a hurry. Completely out of breath, trying to reach a designated meeting point on time. Breathless, he thought about being terribly late on such an important day. His comrades, already at the agreed meeting point, saw our protagonist rushing towards them. His comrades included a woman named Kim Jimin, belonging to the Dawon Guild and having the class of a warrior. She was responsible for melee damage and was at the C rank. Her teammate, Lim Do-won, also at the C rank and a member of the Dawon Guild, belonged to the Garter class and had the main role of taking the most damage. Lim was not particularly pleased that our protagonist, a newcomer on his first day, arrived late, and he made his displeasure evident. On the other hand, Kim reminded him that it was usually him who was always late and tried to calm him down. Our protagonist, who went by the name Shin Junseo, sincerely apologized for his tardiness and took a moment to catch his breath, visibly exhausted. Unlike his two comrades, Shin was not at the C rank but one rank below at the D rank. The class to which he belonged was called Maker, specializing in creating weapons to support his comrades. Lim attempted to mask his frustration and anger over Shin's tardiness, saying that it wasn't a big deal as he was only a few minutes late. Kim also patted Shin on the shoulder, trying to ease his nervousness, and suggested they continue together, talking along the way. Additionally, she explained that the other two members of the group were already inside the cave they were about to enter. However, Shin knew that even though his two group members were trying to cheer him up and alleviate his nervousness, things looked really bad for him. 3 months had passed since he joined their guild, and on his first dungeon raid, he was late. All 3 of them stood before a large, blue, mana-like portal. Shin looked up and examined the portal more closely. He had to take a moment to realize what was now before him. This was his first dungeon raid as a supporter. As Shin continued to gaze into the deep dark blue portal, he realized that he had to prove himself in this raid, to show that he had a certain utility for his comrades and the guild. Inside the dungeon, it was cold, and the walls were covered in icy crystals. One of the other group members, who had been in the dungeon early, asked Shin if this was his first dungeon. It was Moon Doyun, a B-rank hunter of the assassin class, also a member of the Dawon Guild, tasked with dealing melee damage. Shin, who had just been looking at Moon's face as he asked the question, turned his gaze away in embarrassment and looked ahead on his path. He admitted that Moon's assumption, that this was his first dungeon raid as a supporter, was correct, but also mentioned that he had been in dungeons a few times before to help people. Moon reassured Shin that it wasn't a significant problem and expressed his intention to start with some explanations to show him how things usually unfolded inside such dungeons. He explained to Shin that supporters typically didn't have abilities like other hunters to directly engage in combat, and therefore, they needed to be much more cautious. Moon also explained that there was a chance Shin might get directly involved in a fight if he stood too close to the combat. However, they wouldn't be able to protect him if he kept too much distance from the group. Moon emphasized the importance of maintaining a certain balance in distance. Looking down at Shin, Moon explained that, due to Shin belonging to the Maker class, his task was to create a dagger for him when given the signal. Finally, Moon asked Shin if this task was relatively easy for him. Despite his nervousness, Shin answered with a simple yes as he turned his gaze back to his comrade, Moon. Nervously, Shin also inquired if that was all he had to do and if there were any other weapons he might need. Moon explained to Shin that this was all and that he was the only one who could use a few extra weapons. However, he also tried to reassure Shin, mentioning that this dungeon was relatively simple. Moreover, it was his first dungeon, and he didn't need to overwork himself or stress too much. He should first get used to the atmosphere and the entire process. While Shin and Moon were talking, a loud scream from the front signaled the group to stop. The last member of the group, also a C-rank hunter named Lee Hyunwoo belonging to the Mage class, informed the group that he could sense mana, indicating the presence of a nearby monster. The group immediately prepared for battle, with Lim at the front with his shield to protect himself and the group. Behind him were Lee and Kim, also readying themselves for the fight. Moon observed the situation a battlefield further back and simultaneously tried to protect Shin, who was at the end of the group. Moon asked Lee if he had any further notes about the mana. Lee explained to Moon that he could identify 3 smaller mana sources and 1 large mana source. Additionally, he mentioned that the large one might be a boss monster. Moon found it somewhat peculiar that a boss monster was so far ahead in a dungeon. Normally, such a monster wouldn't appear so far forward. Moon didn't show his doubts and ordered the group that he would take care of the boss monster while the others should handle the smaller mana sources. Moon then turned to Shin and asked him how long it would take to make a dagger if he had to hurry. Shin explained that he would need about 20 seconds if he rushed, but he also noted that his weapons would only last for a little less than a minute. Moon took off his breath mask and said that it would be sufficient, instructing Shin to start producing the weapons. He wanted to end the fight in less than 40 seconds. Shortly after the group prepared for battle, 3 smaller and 1 larger crystal lizard rushed towards the group. The smaller crystal lizards were classified as level D threats. These monsters typically grew on mana stones that grew in dungeons. The appearance and abilities of these monsters depended on the type of mana stones they grew on. Lim and Kim were both eager for the upcoming fight, looking forward to the action. Lim immediately used one of his abilities, emitting a terrifying purple presence. He stomped one of his feet on the ground, almost causing it to collapse. Then he lifted his heavy shield high, only to slam it down on the ground with tremendous force, triggering a massive shockwave. Kim wasn't standing idly by her group members, she also charged forward simultaneously. With her right fist, she struck one of the crystal lizards in the face and then smoothly retreated with a graceful backflip. As she landed on the ground with a superhero pose, the crystal lizard was incapacitated and knocked out. However, the other two smaller lizards had already recovered from Lim's attack and charged towards the group again. Only the larger, purple crystal lizard was still somewhat dealing with the effects of Lim's ability, paralyzed on the ground. Kim understood the situation immediately and warned her comrades. She said they should be cautious and that the two smaller lizards were making their way to attack. Lim shielded the group's mage with his massive shield while the mage reached out his hand to cast his magic. Confident and with a clear goal in mind, Lee conjured his fire magic onto the smaller lizards. As if out of nowhere, many smaller fireballs flew onto the battlefield ahead of him, causing numerous smaller explosions and igniting the two other smaller crystal lizards. Lee and Lim were relatively pleased afterward, feeling they had worked well together as a team and successfully completed their task. They wanted to rush to the aid of the other group members immediately after mastering their assignment. Shin observed the situation and had to admit that this teamwork and task distribution were quite impressive. For the first time, he got a sense of how a guild collaborated and how a battle ideally unfolded. While contemplating this, he was in the process of creating a dagger with his magic for Moon. Moon, looking at the momentarily distracted Shin, asked him how much longer he needed for his weapon. This brought Shin back to his senses, and he created the weapon Moon had requested. Once Shin was back in focus, he also realized that in this battle, there was no time to be distracted. He, like his comrades, had to remain focused. Concentrated, Shin tried to complete the weapon-making process. Shin's ability, making, allowed him to create objects using his mana. The strength and durability of the object depended on the amount of mana the creator possessed. Consequently, Shin's weapons were not the best. When the dagger Moon had requested was ready, Shin threw it directly towards him. Moon simultaneously sprinted forward, adjusting his speed to match Shin's throw, catching the weapon during his forward movement. He enveloped the dagger with a fearsome, demon-like, purple shadow aura to enhance it. Similar to Shin's ability, the strength of this aura depended on the amount and quality of the user's mana. Moon, without hesitation, rushed towards the slightly larger, purple crystal lizard, ready to attack. With a single strike from his dagger, enveloped in his shadow aura, he severed the head of the crystal lizard, defeating it, and the head fell to the ground. The weapon, covered in the fearsome purple shadow aura, then disappeared from Moon's hands. Now that the battle was over, the group regrouped, and Lim asked his comrades if any of them had been injured during the fight. However, Kim mentioned that everyone seemed to be well and uninjured. Shin, still impressed by the situation he found himself in a few minutes ago, had to admit that each of his comrades was truly incredible and that the guild was better than he initially thought. He looked at his group and also had to acknowledge that their teamwork seemed flawless. He believed that the guild could be among the top guilds and would surely garner a lot of attention and praise if they continued like this. Shin looked down at his hand and knew that, compared to his groupmates, he wasn't much of a help. He had let himself get distracted in the midst of the battle, and he was only capable of creating a single dagger, which took 20 seconds to become usable. He felt inadequate to work in a great group. Just as he was pondering this, he heard Moon telling him that he did a good job and praised him. Moon also asked Shin if he was hurt. Shin thanked Moon but expressed his embarrassment, feeling that he hadn't been much help. Moon asked Shin what he was talking about and explained that, due to his ability, he saved a lot of money. He clarified that because his ability made weapons disappear when covered in a shadow aura, he would have to keep buying new weapons and would go broke even if he bought the cheapest weapon. Therefore, Moon didn't need anyone in his group with the Maker ability. He further explained to Shin that the strength of the weapon he made didn't matter, what was essential for him was that the weapon had a bit of mana to activate his ability. Moon congratulated Shin again with a smile for the outstanding job he did on his first dungeon raid. He also expressed his anticipation for future adventures with Shin, hoping he wouldn't leave the group too soon. Shin, pleased with the gratitude from his group member, smiled as well and said that he would do his best in the future. Lim couldn't wait any longer and asked if they could finally pick up the loot they obtained and move on. Just as Lim spoke, the ground trembled, along with the entire dungeon. Panic reflected in the eyes of the group members. Lee asked his friends if it could be that the dungeon was already collapsing since they defeated the boss. However, Shin recognized that it must be something else, pointing his finger forward and directing the attention of his group members to a collapsing wall. The group quickly calmed down, and Lee conjured some light with his magic and staff so that everyone could see. He turned to the others and said that the newly opened path must be a secret passage connecting two locations. Moon pondered briefly about what this could mean and if it might be a secret path. Lim was completely dazzled by this secret path and, due to his knack for connecting things, could only think about hidden treasures. Without thinking, he wanted to go straight along it. Kim, too, was immediately captivated by her fantasies, with hidden treasures the only thing on her mind. Like her group member, she wanted to plunge into the mysterious path without a second thought. Only Lee could think a bit more and tried to calm his comrades. Moon asked Lee if he could use his magic to detect potential dangers, to which Lee replied negatively, saying that he couldn't perceive hidden dangers in the new secret path. Moon then explained that, due to no visible threat, there was no reason not to enter the mysterious path and explore it. He thus gave the command to enter the cave. Even Lee had to yield to the guild master's will, sighed, and said that they would continue exploring the cave together. Moon turned to Shin and gave him the order to proceed into the cave with him. The group, led by Kim, Lee, and Lim, carelessly continued their way into the cave. Suddenly, a massive crystal skull appeared, roaring as it tried to chase Shin. Panicked, Shin ran as fast as he could away from the crystalline iron golem, wondering what in the world was happening. With panic in his eyes, he kept running without looking back even once. He thought about why everyone except him was dead. Lim and Kim were pierced by the cave's crystals. And Lee and Moon were completely incapacitated, defeated by the crystal iron golem. Shin couldn't comprehend why such a monster would be in a D-rank dungeon and that he had never heard of a monster that couldn't be located with magic. During his life-or-death sprint, Shin reflexively glanced back and realized that the monster had caught up with him, preparing to strike with its right hand. Shin was sent flying across the cave, taking a direct hit from the massive crystal iron golem. He landed forcefully on the cave floor, dealing with serious injuries. Even though his current situation seemed hopeless, he tried to get up and continue running for his life. However, the slow and terrifying crystal iron golem wasted no time and charged after Shin's body. Refusing to give up without a fight, Shin, in a panic, attempted to create a weapon to defend himself despite his injuries. Against the odds, he managed to craft a dagger. Holding it in his hand, he gained some momentum and threw the dagger in panic towards the crystal iron golem. However, the golem effortlessly deflected the attack as if nothing had happened. After Shin's desperate attack, the golem prepared for a second strike, swinging its right fist with tremendous force. The impact created a massive explosion and a large hole in the floor of the crystal cave, into which Shin fell. In the midst of this hole was a kind of lake, and Shin descended into the water. Due to his injuries, he could barely move and sank deeper into the water. Slowly, his eyes closed, and he wondered if this was the end of his life. He thought about being just a D-rank supporter without even the most basic skills like healing. He also reflected on finding a guild that truly needed him, only to panic and run away at the first sign of danger. In self-pity and self-hatred, Shin believed someone else would have been a greater help than himself. Shin's strength waned, and he closed his eyes, wishing he had never become an awakened hunter and had never chased such a dream. Just as he thought this, a system window opened beside his body, informing him that he had discovered a special spring, with the exact details censored. Another system window then informed Shin that he had now fulfilled all the conditions to become a player. Suddenly, full of energy, Shin opened his eyes. Bright lights surrounded him, and he felt rejuvenated. Overwhelmed by the magic and energy, he opened his mouth, releasing a few bubbles. Once again, a system window appeared, welcoming Shin Junseonim as a player. Shin stared with wide-open eyes at the small system window in front of him, momentarily forgetting the threatening situation he was in. Shortly afterward, another system window appeared next to the existing one, asking him if he wanted to view the reward he had received as a player for his awakening. Shin still didn't fully grasp what was happening and was uncertain about the meaning of the terms player and reward. Suddenly, however, reality caught up with him. His body adapted to the underwater environment, and he frantically tried to breathe, but struggled in vain, only emitting bubbles. Unstoppably, he sank into the depths of the lake, but managed to maintain composure and close his mouth with his last strength. Even though he wasn't sure of what was happening around him, Shin had to make a decision. Since he had no other choice and his situation couldn't get any worse, he chose to answer the mysterious message with a yes and accept his reward. He reached out his hand and selected the yes option on the mysterious system window, causing it to glow brightly. Out of nowhere, sword-like, glowing spectral weapons appeared before Shin. One by one, he raised them from the lake, now standing at the edge of the abyss. As he took the final step and emerged onto the surface of the cave, he caught sight of the crystalline golem that had previously chased him through the cavern. A small, luminous blue aura hovered around Shin. And his posture differed significantly from his previous battle against the golem. The system window that appeared after Shin chose to receive the reward for his awakening as a player explained that he would absorb the experience from his previous life. In a trance-like state, Shin stood before the golem, motionless and without the slightest movement. No emotions could be discerned on his face, neither hatred, sorrow, nor fear. His body became increasingly enveloped in an aura of vibrant blue mana, which was unusual considering Shin didn't possess much mana due to his rank. Shin's unusually calm demeanor left the golem unaffected. Without wasting much time, the golem launched another attack. Suddenly, in the midst of the attack, Shin opened his previously closed eyes, now flashing blue due to the immense mana surging through. A system window announced that the reward was now fully distributed. All around Shin, sword-like spectral weapons continued to appear out of nowhere. This time, they weren't serving as a staircase but were deployed offensively. The blades pointed directly at the crystalline golem, ready to dismember it into its small crystal components. With insane speed, all the weapons flew toward the golem, critically hitting it, preventing it from executing its previously prepared attack. Shin's impressive attack threw even the massive crystalline golem backward, inflicting significant damage. However, Shin, who suddenly experienced a tremendous surge in his powers and had not yet had time to deal with the other memories now emerging in his mind, suffered from severe headaches. He clutched his head with his hand to better control the pain. Confused about why he was suddenly experiencing such pain, Shin tried to understand why unfamiliar memories were surfacing in his mind, memories he hadn't lived himself. Due to the intense pain, Shin momentarily forgot that he was still in the midst of a battle. However, as he perceived the pain and gradually refocused on things other than the headaches, he noticed that the golem had also somewhat recovered and was gearing up for a counterattack. The golem charged towards Shin, swinging its right fist for a mighty blow. Due to the force of the blow, a tremendous amount of air was simultaneously pushed away. However, even this powerful attack from the golem couldn't hit Shin anymore. Instead, it rebounded against a mana-like shield that Shin had created using his magic. Behind this protection, he stood unharmed in safety. At that moment, he could hardly believe that such an attack from the golem had caused him no harm and that his shield could withstand even a golem-type monster without breaking. However, Shin had to realize that he had to exert more and more effort to maintain the shield as the golem didn't stop applying pressure on it. This led to the shield being destroyed a few seconds later. Nevertheless, Shin managed to evade the golem's attack, even though it was surprising for him that his shield was destroyed. While Shin was dodging the golem's attack, he began to understand and utilize the memories in his head. It became clear to him that if the memories were true, he would have the exact strategy to defeat a golem-type monster. He knew the weaknesses and necessary tactics, understanding, for instance, that a monster class like this had no direct weak point. Without giving Shin a moment to catch his breath, the golem continued its attacks undeterred, relentlessly advancing. Shin was aware that even in the case of significant damage to the golem, it could heal itself through its regenerative abilities. Since his current opponent belonged to the golem-type category, he revealed another ability called Grid World. Immediately, a grid pattern could be seen in his eyes, and the world around him seemed to be divided into finer boxes. Thanks to his memories, Shin knew that overcoming the golem's regenerative ability required inflicting substantial damage from various angles simultaneously. The Grid World ability supported Shin in this endeavor. It placed Shin at the center of a large grid that overlaid the world. Each box had the same radius and distance from one another. Immediately after the grid spread out in front of Shin, he created more spectral swords using his other magic. These swords poised themselves to rain down on the golem from different angles, aided by another ability granted to him by Grid World, allowing him to freely move his creations within the center of this grid as he wished. After Shin had created enough of these spectral swords, he signaled them by clenching his fist to attack. Determination was evident on his face, intending to end this battle and avenge his friends. Immediately, the swords followed the given command with impressive speed and descended upon the golem. The force and speed they developed during their approach to the golem triggered a massive explosion, kicking up dust. As the dust slowly settled, the first thing Shin saw was the claws of the golem lying on the ground. A few seconds later, as the remaining dust cleared, it became apparent that the entire golem and its components lay defeated on the ground, and even its regenerative ability could not help in the face of the damage. Shin slowly approached the golem's face and looked down upon it. He breathed a sigh of relief and was glad to have won the battle. While he gazed down at the defeated golem, he recognized that his ability, Grid World, served not only to create his creations more quickly but also had the potential to function as an offensive capability if further improved. Suddenly, out of nowhere, another censored system message appeared, informing Shin that he had defeated a boss. As Shin looked at the system window, he noticed that he couldn't read any further information about the dungeon or the just defeated monster. However, he observed that something was happening on the debris of the golem. A lilac aura gathered from the golem's debris, flew towards Shin, and compressed into a small lilac sphere. Another system window appeared, explaining that Shin had automatically used one of his abilities, leading to magic absorption. The remaining magic within the golem was drawn out and formed the small lilac sphere now hovering in Shin's hand. Shin couldn't believe what had just happened and questioned himself about the meaning of it all and what he held in his hand. After Shin successfully absorbed the lilac sphere into himself, he continued to gaze at his hand, trying to piece by piece contemplate everything he had just experienced in his thoughts. Firstly, it occurred to him that memories from his previous life were now in his head. Although he didn't precisely understand what all of this meant and what exactly was meant by the previous memories, he clearly recognized that the person in his memories was definitely himself. More specifically, he knew that these memories were a few years into the future, in a world completely destroyed, with only the remnants of a once thriving civilization evident in a few ruins. Shin also recalled some things that now seemed too dreadful to contemplate. Apart from his memories, he also had the experiences and knowledge of his future self. However, Shin knew beyond that, even if this was the future, it might not be the same future he was currently in. An indication of this was that there were currently too many things out of their proper place. An example was that Shin could summon a system window listing his abilities from top to bottom. This was something he couldn't do in his previous life, and only now, as he gazed at the system window, did he realize that he had indeed become a player. Shin knew that players were those chosen after their awakening. However, he was also aware that, if he could trust his memories, at this point in his world, there shouldn't be any players yet. It was only in 2 years that a small number of awakened individuals would be chosen to become players. Among them was Moon, the assassin, who unfortunately lost his life in the battle with the crystal-like golem. Only those who became players could see the system-like window, others could not perceive it. Therefore, Shin and his friends in the alternative future were surprised when they saw what their leader was staring at, as they couldn't perceive the window themselves. Shin remembered that in this alternative future, things like a system window were more mocked and considered a kind of joke that people didn't believe in. Thus, many of the awakened were shocked and they discovered that this mysterious thing actually existed. Nevertheless, this system was not the only thing given to the so-called players. Regardless of the system, each player received an additional reward. They gained much stronger powers and abilities, independent of the powers they already possessed as awakened individuals. The system and the rewards these individuals received seemingly out of nowhere were responsible for these players experiencing explosive growth and becoming much stronger than other awakened individuals. Shin remembered that, thanks to Moon, the guild leader of the Dawon Guild who was chosen as a player in the alternative future, he was responsible for turning his guild into one of the top guilds. Even though Shin had no direct connection to this guild in the alternative future. This steadily growing guild was one reason he had become so strong. At first, Shin wasn't particularly confident when he heard about this guild, but it was precisely this community that had made him so strong. Shin also discovered that in the system's skills window, he could see all the abilities he had acquired in his past. Even in the past, he had found this ability very practical, but now that he could apply it himself, he could hardly believe how useful it truly was. Shin compared the abilities and knowledge he had taken from his previous life with those he saw in the window. In doing so, he realized that the ability he had applied to the golem's corpse did not come from his previous life. It was the passive ability of magic absorption, ensuring that collecting a certain amount of energy from contaminated mana found in dungeons would lead to further rewards. Shin was aware that he had never heard of such an ability and wondered if it was a unique gift that was unique to him alone. He carefully read through the description of the ability and already had an idea of what energy might be meant, but he intended to think more about it later. For him, the most important thing now was to properly recover his friends, with whom he now shared far more memories than just a few hours ago, and to bury their bodies decently. As he looked at the bodies of his friends, the pain on Shin's face was evident. As well as the fact that he would have preferred to begin mourning for his friends. After recovering his friends and reporting to the Hunter Association headquarters, Shin set off on his way. The headquarters was an impressive square building with multiple floors in the heart of the city. As Shin made his way, 2 agents of the Hunter Association observed him through the blinds. An orange-haired woman asked her superior if it was really okay to just send Shin home like that. The superior was somewhat surprised by this question and inquired why she was asking him such a thing. Both continued to watch Shin as the orange-haired woman explained that it seemed strange for a small guild to be attacked in the midst of an unconfirmed dungeon, with 4 out of 5 members losing their lives in the attack. She also found it peculiar that the sole survivor of the attack was a simple Class D supporter. She further explained to her superior that she could understand it if Shin had simply run away while his comrades fought for their lives. However, this was not the case, as Shin had evidently even taken care of the dead bodies of his comrades and properly informed the association about the incident. The woman noted that they couldn't secure any further evidence, the gate had already disappeared, and they couldn't verify Shin's story. Despite her explanation, she asked her superior once again what he thought of the whole situation, emphasizing once more that she believed something fishy was going on. After hearing her doubts, the superior sarcastically asked if she really believed that a Class D-ranked hunter working as a supporter could defeat his comrades. He playfully tapped her head with a small file and told her to wake up, as this was not a civil case. In addition, the senior pointed out that she knew very well that even if something suspicious was going on, they couldn't gather any clues in the dungeon. They could only secure the evidence that gradually came to light. The orange-haired employee didn't fully accept this and, due to the tap with the small file, already had tears in her eyes. She tried to alleviate the pain on her head with her hands. The senior continued and asked if she had any other concerns but also explained to her that such incidents had been occurring more frequently lately. As he turned away from his employee, he explained what he meant by more and more hunters finding gates but not reporting them to the association. In such cases, the gate and the right to conquer the dungeon within would be auctioned off, and these hunters would only receive a small portion of the proceeds. That's why more and more were risking their lives, independently entering these dungeons without prior notice. The senior, contemplating Shin's case further, clenched the file in his hand tighter. From his experience, he knew that it was nearly impossible for a small, unknown guild to conquer such a dungeon, and it was akin to a gamble with death. As he continued down the corridor, leaving his employee alone in the hallway, he called out from a distance that she could arrange for another meeting or something similar with Shin if she wasn't satisfied with what they had already learned. The orange-haired employee understood her senior's standpoint, thanked him for his time, and bid farewell. The senior walked down the corridor alone, illuminated by the evening sun, and looked into the file. As he did so, he couldn't help but think of Shin. Murmuring, he repeated Shin's name over and over, pondering that even after all that had been said, this case didn't feel like a normal one. The senior found the situation quite understandable and could relate to many aspects of it. Nevertheless, he had a lingering feeling that something was amiss. Initially, he pondered that Shin's demeanor during the investigation and questioning had been far too calm. Given his lack of experience in a dungeon and the tragic ordeal he had gone through, it would have been normal to expect a more agitated and panicked reaction. Furthermore, the senior thought that the connections Shin explained regarding the events in the dungeon were coherent and clear, even though some details were omitted in between. However, he was aware that this might be attributed to the personality of the person being questioned, having dealt with such individuals in the past. Nonetheless, certain doubts lingered, preventing a clear vision of the future. He knew that something didn't add up, even if he wasn't exactly sure what it was. This gnawed at the senior, and he found it frustrating. Eventually, he took a deep breath and reminded himself that this had nothing to do with him, and he shouldn't worry about it at the moment. As the senior and his orange-haired colleague conversed, Shin exited the building. He crossed a small bridge and strolled along the street, glancing at his phone. The setting sun bathed the horizon in a radiant golden orange. Shin's first instinct was to search for specific things on the internet using his phone. The more he contemplated the dungeon he had explored with his former group, the stranger it seemed that it was an unconfirmed gate. Shin found it peculiar since his memories indicated that this dungeon did not exist before, and his group always made sure to officially acquire dungeons they intended to conquer through auctions. This dungeon was no exception. It bore the official stamp of the association, even though it contradicted the fact that this gate was never sold by the association and was an unconfirmed gate. Shin pondered whether someone had infiltrated the association and deceived the Dawon Guild or if the association was directly involved. However, while Shin continued to look at his phone, he was not only disturbed by the situation with the association but also by the growing issue of missing individuals in unconfirmed dungeons. He came across a post on his phone that reported precisely such an incident. The unease in Shin's thoughts grew as he realized that the missing individuals were all future players, including his former guild master, Moon Doyun. Some of them were destined to play a crucial role in the future and become heroes in history. Suddenly, Shin halted, realizing that someone had to ensure these promising individuals had no room to become heroes. He gazed at the golden sunset towards the city and made the decision to conceal his abilities. Currently, he was the sole survivor of a mysterious case where others had inexplicably disappeared. Shin knew that any peculiar behavior could lead him to appear directly on the radar of the culprit. Nevertheless, in that moment, he considered what the next sensible step would be. With a time frame of 2 years until the first selection of players, he aimed to mobilize and develop all his abilities by then. To get a rough overview, Shin extended his hand, summoning several system windows that formed a circle around him. Shin's plan was to find a way to become stronger and grow without attracting too much attention. He sifted through the system windows to find a useful ability, carefully selecting it with his index finger. A year later, our story takes place in a densely wooded forest. The sky had taken on the color of the forest, stretching for miles until it was bounded by some gigantic mountains. Battle noises were heard repeatedly from this inconspicuous forest. In the midst of the forest, one could occasionally see something smaller and green sparkling, from which the noises emanated. A young man in jeans, a green jacket, and yellow hair was currently engaged in a battle with a monster. His sword repeatedly struck the monster's rusty shield, creating the noises. As this fight had been going on for a while, the young man's sword was on the verge of breaking as it repeatedly clashed against the monster's shield. By chance, the sword broke shortly thereafter in another strike, shocking the man as he hadn't expected it. His eyes widened, and his face took on a panicked expression. Seizing the opportunity, the monster, which had endured the man's attacks with little damage, delivered a powerful blow. This hit sent the young man forcefully through the forest. The impact had caused significant damage to the young man. Despite the injuries, the man managed to drive his remaining sword into the ground, somewhat cushioning the recoil. Even as he recovered from the blow, he knew exactly how dire his situation was, and his face reflected despair. The monster he was fighting didn't give the young man any time to rest. With a mighty leap, the monster approached the young man, letting out a deafening roar from its mouth. The creature jumped toward the man with its muscular legs and threatening belly, its sharp teeth clearly visible. Just before another devastating blow could reach the young man, he managed to evade it with a small sidestep, barely escaping harm. Nevertheless, the situation had hardly improved. His weapon was still broken, and his friends behind him, including a shield bearer, another knight, a sorceress, and a priestess, displayed obvious fear, much like the young man with yellow hair. In this perilous situation, his friends could do little. The monster, a Gnoll Lord with a danger level of D, continued its relentless pursuit of the humans. Its blood-red eyes glowed with fury, showing no intention of giving up the chase. With slow but aggressive steps, the monster approached the group. Saliva slowly dripped from its sharp teeth, while its eyes continued to glow intensely. The physical abilities of this Gnoll Lord far exceeded those of an average gnoll. Furthermore, the gnoll's leather not only provided increased resistance against physical attacks but could also negate and reflect magical attacks. Despite his immense fear, the young blonde man stood tall, his sword aimed at the monstrous Gnoll Lord. He wondered why such a creature was present in an E-rank dungeon. He knew well that even D-rank hunters would have serious difficulties with such creatures and that they were not easy to defeat. Suddenly, the monstrous gnoll charged at the young man again, seemingly out of nowhere, ready to defeat him with its sharp club. However, just as the gnoll was about to attack, the young man with the shield, among his friends, stepped forward and stopped the assault. He took his enormous square shield and extended it with both hands to successfully block the attack. Even though he had successfully repelled the assault, he realized it wasn't easy to withstand the pressure as the gnoll continued to strike his shield. While the gnoll kept pounding on the young man's shield, the black-haired one spoke to his comrades, emphasizing that they wouldn't win the fight by simply blocking the creature's attacks. The pressure from the continued assaults was increasing, and he shouted to his comrades that they should do something as long as it would inflict damage on the monster. Unfortunately, the blonde man was completely paralyzed with fear, and he couldn't help but think of the nickname of the Gnoll Lord, known as the Death God of low-level hunters. The designation, Death God, for Gnoll Lord stemmed not only from their increased physical defense but also from their greater immunity to magic, as mentioned earlier. While the young man was aware of this fact, he continued to anxiously glance back at his 3 remaining group members. Normally, lower-level monsters were highly susceptible to magic. So in the lower-level range, reliance was mainly on magical attacks. This was also the first moment when his group members responsible for magical damage struggled with fear, as they couldn't directly participate in the fight. As his group mates only mastered low-level magic and hadn't reached a higher level of magical proficiency, the group began to fall apart. Although the situation seemed hopeless, the blonde man with the broken sword tried to find a solution. He was aware that he was the only one in the group who could deal exclusively physical damage. However, he also knew about his weakness in close combat and the complete destruction of his weapon, preventing him from directly participating in the fight. He watched his comrade, who continued to deflect the monster's attacks and remain composed. Amidst self-blame and self-loathing, he tried to come up with a solution. He realized he had no alternative weapon with him and wondered how he could continue the assault. With regret, he reflected on how greedy he had been. If he had known what awaited him in this dungeon, he would have gathered the maximum number of people and not entered with a smaller group. He couldn't believe that his greed had led the situation to spiral out of control. While plagued by self-doubt, the young man heard a small noise from the side. His gaze magically turned toward the sound, and in the distance, he saw a person with a pickaxe. Extracting mana crystals. This person was Shin, who served as an assistant in this dungeon. As an assistant, Shin supported groups that didn't engage in combat, taking on the roles of collecting and transporting byproducts such as magic stones. Anyone with the ability to sense a small amount of mana could perform this task. These individuals were often not highly regarded by other group participants and accordingly not well paid. Essentially, an assistant was a kind of errand runner in the group. The young blonde man was somewhat surprised that an assistant was in the middle of this dungeon but also remembered that their group had included an assistant. He was also surprised that the group was currently in a very difficult battle. On the verge of losing and dying, and that Shin was calmly continuing his task without fear. Out of nowhere, the young blonde man's eyes widened as he saw Shin make his pickaxe disappear with the help of his ability. Realizing that the ability was created with Shin's skill, he thought that Shin might have the ability of a maker. Even if he believed that the quality of Shin's creations might not be excellent, it would at least give him a chance to participate in the fight again. Desperately, he tried to reach Shin and handed a letter through the dense forest to him. Shin heard the call of the young man and turned towards him. The young blonde man, still filled with adrenaline from head to toe, as he couldn't forget the ongoing battle, hurriedly ran to Shin and asked him hopefully if it could be that he possessed the ability of a maker and if he could create a new sword for him. Shin confirmed the assumption and told him that he was indeed able to create a sword for him. The blonde man, still under the influence of adrenaline, hastily asked Shin if he could please make him a sturdy sword. Surprisingly, Shin apologized and told him that they had hired him as an assistant, not a supporter, and consequently, he wouldn't craft a sword for him. Somewhat angry and still panicked, the young blonde man tried to explain to Shin the dire situation they were currently in. He told him that now was not the time for consideration and asked Shin if he couldn't see that they were on the verge of dying. He pleaded with Shin to focus on the battle, stating that as a team, they wouldn't be able to defeat this Gnoll Lord, and he would die in the process. Shin sighed and relented. With the help of his abilities, he created a new weapon for the young blonde man but also mentioned that he had some conditions. As the young blonde man looked down at his new weapon in amazement, Shin explained that once they successfully completed this dungeon, they should forget everything about his ability. When dividing the loot, he requested to be paid as an average supporter. After Shin laid out his conditions, and the young blonde man saw the quality of his new weapon, he became somewhat angry. He couldn't believe that someone who couldn't even get a job as a maker would be wandering around as a mere assistant. Despite the fact that the weapons he could create had such high quality. Furthermore, he was annoyed that Shin was setting such conditions for his help, and in his anger, he asked him if he thought someone with weapons alone could tackle a dungeon on their own. Shin laughed in response, showing a slight grin. He explained to the young blonde man that a good weapon and good equipment were essential elements to clear a dungeon. Consequently, the shield of the black-haired group member was also improved, as well as the sword of the other group member who protected the magicians in the group. As Shin showcased the full power of his ability, the blonde-haired young man was quite astonished. He realized that with this essential element, their team would definitely be able to overcome this dungeon. Some time later, in the headquarters of the Overkill Guild, one of the 3 largest Korean guilds situated in the heart of the metropolis, petite feet made their way to a door. In front of it appeared the black silhouette of a small woman. The person in the room invited the petite woman with red hair in a black secretary dress to come in. The assistant informed the president of the Overkill Guild that the Awakeners Association had sent a request for cooperation. The president, seated at his desk, asked the secretary if the request was related to dungeons with an undefined rank. The assistant confirmed this and explained that it was, on the surface, a cooperation request. At the same time, she let her superior know that the Awakeners Association could basically demand any sum for their assistance. Bored, the president glanced at his messages and asked the secretary if the Awakeners Association had any other choice than to ask his guild for help with this problem. He knew that there were hardly any Awakeners who could even enter a gate that had once been closed. While going through the news and reading an article about another dungeon with the error rank appearing, which was fortunately defeated, something caught the president's sharp eyes. And saw that Shin was at the edge of the picture. The president was sure he had seen this face before. He remembered that a few weeks ago, another dungeon with the error rank had appeared in Seochodong. He was coincidentally sent to the area and passed by the gate crime scene. He was quite certain that he had seen Shin at that crime scene, and according to the records, Shin was merely serving as a helper in the dungeon group. The president was also certain that even though the opportunities for such error dungeons had somewhat increased lately, they were still quite rare. He knew that dungeons with the error rank usually didn't allow survivors, and those who did survive such dungeons could be counted on one hand. It became clear to him that Shin, as a helper, had not only survived a group of such dungeons but that the article had already reported twice on how he had achieved this. Lost in his thoughts, the guildmaster of the Overkill Guild had to consider that this could not be a mere coincidence. While the guildmaster of the Overkill Guild was still lost in his thoughts, the pretty little red-haired assistant spoke up and explained to him that it seemed that lately, more dungeons with the error rank were appearing. She also reported that a few days ago, a D-rank dungeon immediately changed to a B-rank dungeon upon the group's entry, and the entire group was instantly taken care of. The president turned back to his secretary, still supporting his face with his hand on the desk, and asked her if the Awakeners Association already had a headache because of all these incidents. The secretary informed her boss that many people criticized the association for their handling of the dungeons. The main task of the association is, in fact, to analyze dungeons and announce their correct rank so that corresponding hunters can conquer them. The president of the Overkill Guild knew that the president of the association must be suffering right now due to all the incidents. Accordingly, he announced to his secretary that those in his guild possessing the ability of peace-breaking should take the opportunity to make some extra money. He also said that in the future, they should temporarily impose additional commissions on their missions, not sit back and observe the situation calmly. When the business matters were settled, the president asked his secretary if she had taken care of the other matter he had asked her about. She explained that she had inquired here and there, but unfortunately, she hadn't found anyone who could create a weapon ranked A or higher. As consolation, she informed him that she had found a B-rank weapon from a Japanese blacksmith and asked her president if he wanted to test this weapon. Before she could continue the sentence, the president interrupted the secretary and explained to her that she knew very well that all weapons would be instantly destroyed once he used his ability. Even a weapon ranked A wouldn't last long against his ability. The president, however, knew that there were only a few people who had the ability of a maker from the beginning at such a high level that they could support him. Therefore, the failure of his secretary to find such a person was not as bad for him. As the president rose from his desk, he instructed his secretary to keep an eye out for someone with the ability. His limit of available weapons was running out, and he had no desire to continue wasting weapons senselessly. His secretary understood this and promised to continue the task. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door to the president's office, and a handsome, slightly older but still young man entered. He reported an incident to President Taeheon. While Taeheon slowly walked through his office to the door, he asked the man what had happened. The man informed the president that the request from the Awakeners Association was about a D-rank dungeon in their area, and there were newcomers from the guild inside. Curious and with a hint of panic, Taeheon asked the man what rank the dungeon assumed after the newcomers entered. Excitedly, the handsome man explained to Taeheon that the new rank of the dungeon was a C-rank dungeon, and moreover, one of the more challenging C-rank dungeons. Taeheon quickly tried to get past the handsome man, stating that he couldn't just stand by while newcomers lost their lives in such a dungeon. He explained that the situation was extremely urgent, and he decided to go himself to rescue the newcomers of his guild. It was a beautiful day, and aside from a slight red aura due to the portal, a lovely blue sky covered the entire city. The trees were green, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves. However, right in the middle of the city stood a giant red gate, guarded by 2 hunters from the association. In front of the portal, many reporters and onlookers gathered, taking photos or reporting on the tragic course of the gate. Suddenly, one of the reporters noticed that the Overkill Guild had arrived. Reflexively, all the resident reporters and curious civilians turned around to catch a glimpse of the guild members. Upon their arrival, Taeheon, his beautiful secretary, and the handsome man were bombarded with flashes of camera lights as if they were stars. The reporters wanted to know from the guild master about the recurring dungeons with the error rank. They also inquired about rumors regarding a cooperation request from the Awakeners Association to him and his guild. Another reporter asked if Taeheon himself showed up because his guild members were deployed as an attack team in this dungeon. Although Taeheon and his 2 companions were accustomed to such pressures, they consistently ignored these questions and focused on reaching the portal. A woman from the Awakeners Association personally thanked Taeheon for his prompt arrival and was surprised that the guild master had appeared in person. Without wasting time, Taeheon directly inquired about the current situation. Together with the woman from the Awakeners Association, he looked at the portal, and she reported that the team exploring the dungeon consisted of 6 hunters, 2 supporters, and 1 helper. She assured Taeheon that all participants of the attack team were well above the required qualification. However, she also had to admit that the total number of only 9 people was somewhat low, considering that upon reanalyzing the dungeon, it was classified as a C-rank dungeon. Curiously, Taeheon asked how long the attack team had been in the dungeon, to which the woman from the Awakeners Association explained that it had been about 2 hours since the team entered the dungeon. Thoughtfully, Taeheon pondered what could have happened to his guild members in 2 hours. He told the woman from the Awakeners Association that he had no idea how many of his people might still be alive, but he assured her that he would do everything in his power to help the survivors in the dungeon. The woman bowed and thanked him. Taeheon and his assistant stood in front of the imposing, gigantic red portal, staring directly into it. Taeheon then let his brought suitcase slam onto the ground, creating a loud bang. After the suitcase hit the ground, Taeheon raised his right hand in front of his secretary, expecting her to know exactly what to do without one of his commands. The petite red-haired secretary, Min Hee-soo, pulled something out of her small shoulder bag, which then began to glow brightly. Min Hee-soo had the ability to open and close a small subspace within objects, and her shoulder bag was such a place for a subspace. She pulled out a katana and handed it to her guild master, Taeheon. Taeheon took possession of the katana directly and held it in front of his head. The blade of the katana ignited and was enveloped in a yellow-orange, fire-like aura. With a powerful swing, Taeheon waved the katana in front of him and cut directly into the midst of the portal. Using this skill trespass, he created a rift in the portal that kept growing. Eventually, a massive hole formed in the portal, allowing re-entry. Taeheon, equipped with the skill transgression that allowed him to penetrate barriers, cut the hole in the portal with his katana. The only downside to this ability was that it applied in a different dimension only for the user. After Taeheon had used the katana once, it immediately dissolved and crumbled before his eyes. Since he couldn't continue fighting with this sword, Min Hee-soo immediately handed him a new one, telling him to please be a bit more careful with this sword. While agreeing with her, Taeheon entered the portal directly, wasting no more time. Barely arriving in the dungeon, he immediately assessed the current situation. After a few steps, he stopped his examination and was surprised by what he found. Before him stretched a large hall with several defeated enemies on the ground. As he looked around, Taeheon noticed that in the middle of the dungeon, there was a different temperature and humidity. Additionally, he recognized, by the smell, that it was a dungeon where reptilian creatures roamed. Upon closer inspection of the ground, he noticed the absence of pollutants. This suggested that the monsters had a certain level of intelligence and consciousness. Taeheon combined this with the dungeon's rank and realized the type of monsters present. Looking down, he saw a defeated lizard man on the D rank. These monsters typically hunted in groups. Compared to other humanoid monsters, they were characterized by a much longer lifespan. With lifespan, intelligence, and combat abilities being proportional to each other, Taeheon could draw precise conclusions about the combat strength and group size of the lizard men in this dungeon based on the corpses. Sprinting rapidly through the room, relying on his initial findings, he continued further into the dungeon to come to the aid of the team as quickly as possible. As he advanced at full speed, his thoughts circled around the possibility that all the group members might already be dead. Therefore, he was visibly surprised when he entered a large room and witnessed what was unfolding before his eyes. It was something he had not expected at all. In the midst of the battle, one of the lizards was charging at a member of the attack team with full speed, attacking him with its large sword. The man successfully parried the lizard's attack with his own sword. While the lizard was engaged in combat with the young man, a woman with long hair tied into a braid seized the opportunity and, from a distance, struck another lizard with her bow. The woman's arrow hit the mark, piercing another red lizard man in the hip. He screamed in pain and spat green blood. Taeheon, still at the entrance of the room, observed the unfolding battlefield and realized that the attack team was in the process of overwhelming the lizards. Upon closer inspection, Taeheon recognized that it was surprising that the attack team could defeat these lizards, as they were usually much faster and stronger. He continued to look into the room and was visibly surprised when he saw the reason for this significant difference in combat strength. At that moment, the green lizard man managed to exert enough pressure to knock away the sword of the young man with his attack. The young man was also surprised by the tremendous force and panicked as the situation looked very grim for him. Without wasting any more time, the green lizard man attacked the man lying on the ground again, who had no way to block the attack. The lizard man took his hand, holding his massive sword, backward and prepared for a powerful strike. Taeheon was about to intervene, knowing that it was not too late to save the life of the man on the ground. However, the lizard man was quicker and could unleash his mighty blow, creating a massive shockwave. As the settled dust slowly cleared, the strike was deflected by a spectral weapon. The lizard man was visibly surprised that the attack did not result in a direct hit, and the man on the ground was still alive. Still in a panic, the man on the ground looked up at his tormentor, while Taeheon rushed from behind to rescue him. Taeheon was also astonished and searched the room for the one responsible. Initially thinking of magic blocking the attack, he quickly realized it was a weapon that had materialized in midair. Attentively scanning the room, he wondered who could create such a weapon. That's when he saw Shin, holding his pickaxe in one hand, after fulfilling the role of a helper with the other hand performing his ability. Shin also noticed that someone was observing him using his ability and shifted his gaze towards Taeheon. Both faced each other, looking at one another, while the room was still lightly filled with dust. Shin's face was quite emotionless, while Taeheon displayed a slight expression of surprise. While Shin and Taeheon exchanged glances, Shin's gaze shifted to the battlefield, where his remaining comrades continued to fight against the two lizard men. Shin gradually counted his comrades engaged in battle, reaching the number 8 before counting himself as the 9th person and then Taeheon as the 10th person. Shin loudly remarked to Taeheon that this was strange, as he distinctly remembered there should only be 9 people in the dungeon. Taeheon was not pleased, and his expression reflected his dissatisfaction. He questioned Shin about what he was doing and why he wasn't helping the rest of the comrades who were all busy dealing with the lizard men. Even with their efforts, his comrades were struggling. One of his comrades was simultaneously pushed back by the red lizard man, losing his weapon in the process and falling to the ground, similar to what happened with the green lizard man and another comrade earlier. Another member of the group, a mage who was positioned slightly behind in the fight, noticed this and rushed to the fallen comrades. However, just like with the green lizard man before, the lizard-like monster seized the opportunity and prepared for another strike. Taeheon, who followed the battle along with Shin, noticed this and sprinted with insane speed to the scene, leaving Shin alone with his pickaxe. Shin looked down and saw the suitcase Taeheon had brought, which still contained one of his swords. As he contemplated this, Shin never thought that Taeheon, the leader of the Overkill Guild, would personally come to rescue a group from a dungeon. While inspecting the weapon in the suitcase, he also wondered why Taeheon would carry a weapon he didn't use. Simultaneously, the thought occurred to me that it could be a spare weapon. However, since Taeheon was now assisting his comrades in his place, Shin stood motionless on the edge of the battlefield, observing the situation without personally getting involved. Taeheon's sword ignited in an orange flaming aura, parrying the lizard man's attack before he could inflict serious harm on the defenseless group member. While Taeheon was busy stopping the lizard man, he called out to the comrades behind him, asking them to please move away from the combat zone. With tears in his eyes, the mage who had run to his group member's aid helped him up, thanked Taeheon, and together they made their escape. At the same time, Taeheon had also overwhelmed the lizard in the one-on-one fight, knocking the sword out of its hand. Now that he had the advantage of a weapon, he once again ignited his sword with a bit more of his orange flaming aura and effortlessly ended the fight with a single triple slash, causing the lizard man to receive substantial wounds throughout his body and then fall motionless to the ground. After winning the battle, Taeheon looked down at his blood-stained sword and noticed that, even though he had not fully utilized his strength, which was at the B rank, it was clearly too weak to withstand his power. The sword slowly disintegrated into smaller pieces after he used his triple slash. Even after defeating one of the two lizard men, Taeheon remained vigilant and immediately noticed another threat emerging before him. The other green lizard had noticed that his friend was killed, fled from the battle with the remaining group members, and rushed towards Taeheon like a madman, without much thought, seeking revenge. Upon reaching Taeheon, the lizard, driven solely by instincts and without much consideration, swung from top to bottom, attempting to crush Taeheon with a powerful blow. However, Taeheon, thanks to his abilities, effortlessly evaded the attack and repositioned himself for a counterattack a bit further away, at Shin's level. Seizing the opportunity, Shin directed his words to Taeheon, asking him, while looking at Taeheon's destroyed sword, if this would always happen when he enveloped his weapon with an ability. Furthermore, Shin added that the sword he was holding would probably be of inferior quality, still ignoring the green lizard, who was now being dealt with by the other group members who were still participating in the fight. Taeheon was not particularly pleased with the question and the way Shin posed it. He asked somewhat angrily if Shin was starting a fight with him. However, when Shin used his ability to create a weapon for Taeheon, he was astonished. Right in front of Taeheon, a weapon of the same type he was holding formed in Shin's bright blue mana in just a few seconds. Taeheon couldn't believe what he was seeing. Shin, having completed his weapon in just a few seconds, told Taeheon to please use this sword to end the fight. He added that Taeheon should not recklessly destroy the poor weapons he had brought with him. Taeheon, still in awe, wondered if Shin had just made this sword float in front of him with a simple hand motion. Taeheon also recognized that Shin was a weapon maker, not just an ordinary one, but an extremely competent and experienced one. However, as he looked at the pickaxe Shin held in his hand, he wondered why someone with Shin's talent would present himself as a mere helper. Taeheon had often heard that low-ranking supporters who didn't have much money could earn some extra income as helpers, but he couldn't believe that Shin would fall into such a category. Shin extended his hand toward the weapon still clutched in Taeheon's grasp, reminding him that the condition for wielding the weapon Shin had crafted was to forget everything about him upon exiting the dungeon. While relieved about parting with the damaged weapon, Taeheon explained that it wouldn't be easy to forget everything just because Shin wanted it. The grip of the weapon then transformed back into bright blue mana, making it impossible for Taeheon to grasp. Shin explained that if Taeheon didn't agree to his condition, he would gladly destroy the rest of his high-grade weapons in this pointless fight and wouldn't assist him any further. Taeheon sighed, considering that even Shin's weapon would be destroyed after a single attack and the use of his ability, just like the other weapons he brought into the dungeon. Nevertheless, he preferred to destroy such a weapon rather than the ones he brought into the dungeon. Accordingly, he agreed to Shin's conditions, agreeing to forget everything once they left the dungeon. Meanwhile, the remaining group members were still busy trying to stop and defeat the lizard. After Taeheon agreed to Shin's conditions, Shin smiled and released his weapon, allowing Taeheon to take it and rush directly into the battle. While the green lizard was still occupied, swinging its weapon and attacking, Taeheon stormed towards it like lightning, once again igniting his weapon with its orange fiery aura to block the lizard's attack. The block with his new sword was so strong that the lizard was visibly surprised as its weapon broke due to the recoil. Taeheon, too, was astonished by the immense stability and strength of Shin's weapon. He looked down at his own weapon and mentally reviewed the block. He had intended to merely block the attack, never expecting to shatter his opponent's weapon in the process. He realized that the control over the new weapon was far greater than usual. He wondered if the incredible strength of the weapon was inherent to the weapon itself. While Shin resumed his work and contemplated the crystal-clear candle in the background, Taeheon wondered if this weapon maker, capable of crafting such a high-ranked weapon, must be someone at least of B rank. However, there was no time to let his thoughts linger, as the lizard, despite its broken weapon, prepared to strike again. Taeheon, knowing the intentions of his opponent, managed to counter the attack in time and strike back at the lizard. He found the situation and Shin quite intriguing, wanting to see what his weapon was capable of and whether he could potentially destroy it. While his sword was embedded in the lizard's body, Taeheon once again manifested a massive aura in the sword and activated one of his abilities, causing the sword and the surroundings behind the lizard to explode, resembling a fiery dragon's breath emanating from the sword. Afterwards, Taeheon grabbed the lizard's shoulder, using it to hold on, swung behind the lizard, and resumed attacking by enveloping the sword once again in its fiery orange aura. He thrust the sword from top to bottom, igniting the lizard's body. The lizard screamed in pain and was defeated by Taeheon's final attack, falling unconscious to the ground. As the lizard lay unconscious on the ground, the first thing Taeheon did was to use Shin's sword, which can consume things, to inspect it closely and determine if it had incurred any scratches from his repeated ability usage. However, as he observed the sword carefully, he was astonished to find not a single scratch. From this, he concluded that the weapon was at least of A rank type, or even S rank. Just as he continued to ponder this, the remaining comrades ran up to him, delighted that the guild master had come personally to save them. They expressed their gratitude with cheerful smiles, relieved that they would now have one less worry and would exit the dungeon unharmed. Taeheon was also relieved that none of his subordinates had been seriously injured. While Shin continued to collect the mana stones, the other group members explained to their leader that they were able to survive the battle for so long because Shin had crafted some weapons for them. Taeheon's gaze abruptly shifted back to Shin, and he slowly approached him, asking for his name. Shin, still busy filling the backpacks, didn't even turn around but responded to the question with another question. He asked Taeheon about the significance of knowing the name of a mere helper. Taeheon explained that it was reasonable to know the name of the person one was addressing. He then introduced himself again. Upon hearing the name, Shin turned to Taeheon and introduced himself with his own name. After Shin had introduced himself to Taeheon, he spoke to the actual group leader and explained that he would deposit the mana stones he had collected at the beginning of the portal. The group leader confirmed and told him to go ahead. However, before Shin could proceed with the task, Taeheon stopped him and asked him to visit the boss room of the dungeon together. When Shin explained that he was just a helper, Taeheon took the bag from Shin, gave it to the group leader, and explained that this dungeon had transformed into an error dungeon. He also mentioned that if they couldn't defeat the boss, no one would be able to leave this dungeon. Taeheon emphasized that it didn't matter whether Shin was a helper or a supporter, he needed his assistance. Shin retorted that, as the guild leader, he was more than capable of defeating the boss on his own. However, Taeheon explained to Shin that, as seen before, no weapon could withstand the immense strength of his ability. Regardless of Shin's talent and ability to defeat the boss independently, he would stand no chance if he broke the weapon Shin had made for him during the fight. Shin was a bit taken aback and proud at this statement, while Taeheon clarified that these were just Shin's thoughts. They were still in an error-level dungeon, and here, there were far more dangerous monsters than ordinary lizards. Taeheon also explained that they should definitely be more than just cautious if the boss of this dungeon turned out to be as strong as they thought. Shin understood that Taeheon was right, relented, replaced the remaining backpacks, and set off deeper into the dungeon with Taeheon. As they progressed further into the dungeon's corridor, Shin asked if it would be enough for him to just accompany Taeheon. Deeper in the dungeon, many small cages hung from the ceiling, a few torches illuminated the room, and numerous cobwebs adorned the ceiling and the cages in the back. When Shin and Taeheon entered the dungeon boss's room, their gazes fell upon a kind of mask. Underneath the person wearing the mask, there was again a huge lizard-like monster. The boss of this dungeon was the Lizard King, classified at the seed danger level. It was the final form that a lizard man could achieve after many years of survival. Despite its small size, its speed and strength were many times greater than that of ordinary lizards. Shin looked visibly focused as he examined the opponent before him, and Taeheon provided him with information that he should better ignore the danger level and details. Taeheon, on the other hand, didn't appear too focused and looked forward to the opportunity to unleash more of his ability and end the fight as quickly as possible. He then ignited Shin's weapon and said they shouldn't be too quick, as his weapon might still break. Shin released some more of his mana and told Taeheon that he had just said that his weapon couldn't possibly break. Together, both sides were ready to face the Lizard King. But it seemed like they didn't take it very seriously. In the face of the Lizard King, Shin told Taeheon not to believe him and that he was more than willing to push his weapon and its durability to the limit. The Lizard King, having sensed the presence of Shin and Taeheon, also prepared to enter the battle, but unlike them, it was much more focused and took the matter much more seriously. The Lizard King eagerly aimed his lance at Shin and Taeheon, simultaneously commanding his lizard-like mount to charge forward and attack them. The Lizard King's mount leaped forward with massive claws directly at the spot where Shin and Taeheon stood. Fortunately, both managed to evade the attack with a nimble leap backward. Taeheon, who also dodged the assault, skillfully jumped off a wall behind him and rushed forward for a counterattack. The Lizard King's mount anticipated the counterattack and prepared to counter it with its armored tail. It successfully delivered a powerful strike against Taeheon. Thanks to Shin's sturdy sword, Taeheon managed to block this attack as well, preventing a direct hit. However, the intense recoil from the strike sent him flying back in the opposite direction. Undeterred, Taeheon seized the momentum from the recoil. Gracefully pushing off the wall again, he soared at full speed toward the Lizard King's mount. Simultaneously, the Lizard King himself initiated an attack. charging into the midst of the battlefield. The lance of the Lizard King and Taeheon's sword clashed, and both faced each other in the midst of the battlefield. The exchanges were dignified, and after a few seconds, both had to abort their attacks, take a step back, and reposition themselves. During this pause, the Lizard King seized the opportunity, leaped onto his mount, grabbed the reins with his lizard-like hands, and ordered an attack, causing his mount to gather an enormous amount of fiery energy in its mouth. As more fiery energy accumulated in the mount's mouth, it expelled it forward in the form of a massive wall of flames. Suddenly, a mana-like wall manifested in front of Taeheon, acting as a shield to protect him from the mount's attack. The flames deflected on either side of the summoned shield, leaving Taeheon unharmed. Shin, who conjured the shield, observed the battle calmly, providing support to Taeheon from a distance. However, the Lizard King in his mount took advantage of the obscured view caused by the flames and charged forward to attack Taeheon once again. Taeheon managed to mostly fend off this attack as well, only being thrown back slightly, landing beside Shin. He questioned Shin about being a weaponsmith and how he could create a shield. Shin explained to Taeheon that a shield could indeed function as a weapon and asked if he had never been struck by one. From that moment, Taeheon was filled with renewed energy in the fight, his eyes gleamed, and the sword he received from Shin once again enveloped itself in orange, flame-like energy. He told Shin that they should put an end to this, as he had many questions he wanted answers to. He then rushed forward into the battlefield faster than ever before, aiming to conclude the fight. Meanwhile, Shin stood casually with his hands in his pockets, eager to see how the battle would unfold. As Taeheon charged toward the Lizard King, the latter took advantage of the opportunity and threw a chain-like weapon at the oncoming Taeheon. At the front of this chain was a sharp blade that could inflict serious damage. However, Taeheon effortlessly parried it, causing it to wrap around the sword he held in his hand. With a strong pull backward, the Lizard King then drew the chain, along with Taeheon attached to it, towards himself. Consequently, Taeheon, along with his weapon, was pulled directly toward the king's mount, left relatively defenseless during the entire flight and vulnerable to a counterattack. Watching this, Shin told Taeheon to stop playing so recklessly and urged him to take the fight more seriously. He extended his hand forward, activating another ability, enveloping his hand in a small blue mana shimmer. Shin once again created a sword in Taeheon's other hand, allowing him to launch a direct counterattack. Seizing the opportunity, Taeheon grabbed the newly formed sword and immediately launched a counterattack. He dispelled the old sword, causing it to dematerialize, and dispatched the Lizard King's mount with just 2 strikes. The Lizard King, witnessing how quickly and efficiently Shin and Taeheon cooperated to incapacitate his mount, was shocked at how easily he could suffer such significant damage. Seeing that the Lizard King was lost in thought and unaware of the swift turn in the battle, Taeheon seized the opportunity for another counterattack. Taking the sword with which he had just defeated the mount, he threw it toward the Lizard King. The king narrowly avoided the sword by moving his head to the side. In the meantime, Taeheon had managed to get close enough to the king and was now right in front of him. With a powerful kick to the abdominal region, Taeheon managed to inflict damage on the Lizard King, propelling him to the ground due to the recoil. However, Taeheon didn't want to give the Lizard King time to recover and rejoin the fight earnestly. He promptly leaped into the air to initiate another attack. While in mid-air, Shin once again created a sword for Taeheon, which he caught, enveloping it in an orange-golden light with his ability. Helpless, the Lizard King could only watch. After executing his attack, the king barely managed to dodge to the side, losing his left arm in the process and sustaining serious damage. Seizing this moment to assess the battlefield, the Lizard King saw Shin standing casually in the middle of the room, taking hold of his weapon's hilt without much thought, and charging towards him to attack. However, Shin, utilizing his ability, shielded himself by creating several smaller shields with his mana. While questioning the meaning behind this attack, Shin allowed his mana to flow freely from his body, creating a terrifying aura around him that crushed any combat desire within the Lizard King. While Shin intimidated the Lizard King from the front with his fearsome aura and absolute defense, Taeheon approached from behind with an equally fearsome aura, exerting immense pressure on him as well. In the eyes of the Lizard King, one could see that he realized his end had come, and there was no escape for him. While Shin and Taeheon dealt with the Lizard King, outside the red portal, a group of reporters and curious civilians were waiting for the dungeon's color to change back to blue, indicating the team's safe exit. This happened shortly, and the portal gradually returned to its normal blue hue. The first change excited everyone, and soon the entire portal was back to its regular blue color. Just a few minutes later, the group led by Taeheon emerged from the portal. Taeheon was immediately surrounded by reporters bombarding him with questions. Journalists sought details about the dungeon's interior, the monsters inside, and the condition of the group members. Taeheon was protected by 2 agents from the Awakeners Association, keeping the reporters at a distance. Min Hee-soo, the handsome young man, inquired if Taeheon was injured. Taeheon assured his 2 friends that he was unharmed and without major injuries. Other members of his guild who had participated in the group thanked their guild master again for personally coming to their aid. While Taeheon conversed with his guild members, Shin seized the moment, out of the spotlight, to distribute the dungeon loot to the appropriate places and disappear. Before leaving, he took one last look at Taeheon and then vanished into the crowd. After Shin's disappearance and the conclusion of his conversation with the guild members, Taeheon was once again questioned by reporters. They wanted to know how it was possible to complete the dungeon so quickly and if it was because this dungeon was too easy for him. Taeheon wanted to clarify that the quick completion of the dungeon was not due to it being too easy for him but attributed the success to the effective collaboration with Shin. However, when he turned around to include Shin in the interview, Taeheon realized that Shin had already departed and was no longer in the immediate vicinity. Meanwhile, the other members of the group were also being interviewed. The reporters framed their questions in a way that implied the only possible answer was that the swift victory was solely thanks to Taeheon. The other guild members affirmed this and explained that their equipment was destroyed during the dungeon. They emphasized how perilous it had been to fight against terrible monsters with damaged gear, and they had only managed it because Taeheon had helped them. Observing the conversation between his guild members and the reporters, Taeheon shook them by the shoulders and questioned why they were spreading such falsehoods. He wanted them to report instead on the person who had crafted such outstanding weapons for them and with whom they had survived for so long. However, the guild members did not know whom Taeheon was referring to. Even when he provided more details and explained that it was the helper who crafted the weapons. The other guild members still couldn't recall Shin. All they could remember was having a helper who entered the dungeon with them and diligently mined crystal ores. The fact that this helper had the ability to craft weapons didn't seem to register with them. Even after the third inquiry, the entire group's response remained unchanged. They found it odd that the helper who entered the dungeon with Taeheon initially had no pickaxe but later used one. The fully packed backpacks that Shin had properly left behind were just there. Taeheon continued to ponder why all the guild members, equipped with weapons by Shin in the dungeon, could easily forget him. He recalled how he himself received Shin's katana and agreed to the conditions. Forgetting everything about his ability after successfully completing the dungeon and exiting it. Taeheon suddenly thought that this might be a skill called rental pay, responsible for the contract with Shin. At the same time, he found it strange that a mere helper could wield such a powerful ability, usually limited to individuals of at least A rank or higher. While immersed in these thoughts, Taeheon was approached by his 2 friends, curious about what was occupying his mind. To catch up with Shin, Taeheon tossed the case containing his weapon to his friend, who caught it and hurried to reach Shin as quickly as possible to talk to him. In doing so, he left his 2 friends amidst the reporters. Min Hee-soo and the handsome man still had no idea what was going on with Taeheon and simply watched as he ran hastily. Taeheon scanned the surrounding area, searching for Shin, but no matter where he looked, he couldn't find him. Just as Taeheon had given up and paused to catch his breath, Shin was only a few meters away, behind a stone wall, calmly staying hidden. Taeheon had no idea that the person he sought was just a few meters away. He stood at the end of the park, contemplating the possibilities that could arise with Shin and his ability. The beautiful garden landscape shimmered in golden hues against the setting sun behind him. It didn't take long for Min Hee-soo and the handsome man to catch up with Taeheon, asking him why he was in such a hurry. Taeheon turned to his secretary, Min Hee-soo, and informed her that he had a task and that she needed to find a specific person. Meanwhile, Shin continued on his way calmly, hoping that Taeheon wouldn't find him any time soon.